Welcome to this tutorial on research questions. This is Dr. Amanda Rockinson-Zapke, and we're going to talk about research questions and more specifically how to write a well-stated research question so that by the end of this tutorial you'll be well equipped to write the research questions for your quantitative proposal or research study. Let's begin by looking at what are the characteristics of a well-stated research question. Well, LaFontaine and Bartos suggest several characteristics. First of all, the research question asks about the relationship between two or more variables, and variables are clearly labeled and clearly defined. Number two, the research question is clearly stated in a question form. Now, you may be laughing about, of course, if you have a research question, you're going to state it in a question form. For example, is there a difference or what is? But you'd be amazed how many beginning researchers actually accidentally stated it as a statement rather than a question. So it asks about the relationship between variables that are clearly labeled and clearly defined. It's clearly stated in question form. It's testable. That means that it's possible to collect data to answer the question. The question does not pose an ethical or moral problem for implementation. It's specific and restricted in scope. That is, your aim is not to solve the world's problems. I often like to talk about this in terms of how my husband and I approach the Grand Canyon. When we go to the Grand Canyon, I take my camera and I wait for the perfect picture to capture what I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing, whereas my husband videos almost the entire time. When you think about a researchable question, you need to approach it like I approach the Grand Canyon, looking for one snapshot of a phenomenon. A good, well-stated question also identifies exactly what it is that you're going to solve. Additionally, a good research question clearly identifies the population that you aim to study. So just by reading the question, it's clear if you're going to study second graders, elementary teachers, or college students. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at these characteristics as we examine an example research question. A beginning researcher asks this question: what is the effectiveness of media-rich technology education on students? Now let's look at each criteria and evaluate it. So first, using LaFontaine and Bartos' guideline, we can state that the question is stated in question form. The researcher did not make a statement, the media-rich technology education will be effective for students, but rather ask the question, what is the effectiveness of media-rich technology education on students? Next, it does not appear to pose any foreseeable ethical or moral problems at this point. There's no major value judgments or anything. Next, the question does ask about the relationship between two variables, technology education and effectiveness. And it's hard to say at this point, it could or couldn't be limited in scope, but if it's looking at one type of technology education and one type of effectiveness, it could be limited in scope. However, as you've probably already seen and figured out, this question is not testable because it doesn't clearly say what the researcher is trying to solve, and it does not clearly define the variables. The population of students also is clearly identified, but my question is, what type of students? Are we looking at elementary students, college students? Are we looking at some type of professional at some organization? We aren't really sure what is meant by number one, effectiveness, number two, media-rich technology, and number three, students. So we need to have some clearer definitions before this is a well-stated research question. Another way to say this is that the terms need to be clearly defined or operationally defined if this question is truly going to be researchable. Let's take a moment and define what is an operational definition before we actually create operational definitions to make this question clearer. An operational definition is a clear and concise definition of how a variable is going to be measured or observed. This is distinctly different from a simple dictionary or narrative definition. For example, in a dictionary, effectiveness is defined as something adequate to accomplish a purpose, producing the intended or expected result. This obviously is not precise enough for research purposes because it defines effectiveness, again, very generally. It's not measurable or observable. So how do we make this term effectiveness more precise, measurable, and observable? Well, we need to ask, what is truly being studied? So if we think about in terms of effectiveness, what does the researcher really mean? Well, let's say, for example, that effectiveness is really the scores on a validated math achievement test or scores on a validated math aptitude test. Simply saying the mean scores on a math achievement or math aptitude test makes that term more precise, more measurable, more observable. There are two other terms that we identified that weren't really that precise, measurable, or observable. That is media-rich technology education. What the researcher truly could be studying is a new math gamification app, and he or she wants to compare it to traditional education. So we're actually talking about the type of media-rich technology education, and more specifically defined as the Math 2.0 gamification app. And last, students. We don't really know who students are. Well, what the researcher may mean is second grade students enrolled in a regular education classroom. So now let's take these more operational definitions and put them into the question to make it a better stated question. So here are several better stated questions. The researcher can use the terms math achievement scores, Math 2.0 gamification application, and second grade students in the following ways to revise the question. He may or she may state, what is the effect of the Math 2.0 gamification app on second grade students' mean math achievement scores? Or is there a difference in the mean math achievement scores of second grade students who participate in the Math 2.0 program as opposed to second grade students who participate in a traditional math class? Or what is the effect of the Math 2.0 gamification app on second grade students' attitudes toward math as measured by the attitudes toward mathematics assessment? Here you can see that the question and what is being studied is much clearer. You can tell that it can be tested. And by operationally defining the terms, specifying the methods of measurement and the specific population, the research is definitely a lot clearer. Now what you may notice is these questions are still maybe a little bit wordy, so we could work on the conciseness and preciseness of it. But overall, we now know that the researcher is studying the effect of the Math 2 gamification app on second grade students, and that he or she is comparing the math gamification app to traditional education, and that by effectiveness, he or she means one of two things, either the math achievement or math attitudes. Now that you've seen the importance of operational definitions for writing a well-stated research question, I also want to state that not only are operational definitions of variables important in identifying exactly what is to be solved, the terminology used to ask about the relationship between the variables is also important. Although not all researchers would agree, I'll acknowledge that, and they oftentimes will use terminology interchangeably, other researchers suggest that the terms that are used in a research question should imply or reflect the research design and statistical analysis that will be used. Let's take a moment and look at this a little bit more closely. Let's say, for example, you want to know the relationship between variables, and you use the term association in your research question. So is there an association between math achievement and, let's say, math attitude? This reflects that you as the researcher plan to probably do a correlational study. So by the use of association, you imply that a simple correlation will be done. second, or a more complex, I guess, correlation. I will clarify that. I didn't mean the word simple. Let's look at another term, difference. If you use the word difference, is there a difference between students' math achievement based on the type of math instruction they receive? You imply that you plan to do some type of group comparison study. So for example, a causal comparative study, a true experimental study, a quasi-experimental study, or a pre-experimental study. So difference implies group comparison. Finally, you may decide to use the term effect. What is the effect of the Math 2.0 gamification application on second grade students' math achievement? If you pose this question, you imply that you plan to conduct an experimental study. And note I said experimental study and not simply a group comparison study. And when we talk in depth about research design, we'll talk more about this, but the only way that you can really state that there's a cause and effect relationship is when you do an experimental study. When you do a causal comparative study, which is a type of group comparison study, you can only say that there's an association or possible cause and effect. So the terminology that you use to explain the relationship that you expect between variables or that you're examining between variables should reflect the design that you plan to use as well as the statistical analysis that you plan to use. Let's make sure that we fully understand this idea by looking at an example. Let's say that a researcher poses the question, is there a difference in university students' perceived learning based on the type of online course in which they participate, using synchronous technologies versus asynchronous only technologies? In this question, we clearly see that the researcher uses the word difference. Now, reflecting back on what we just learned, what type of research study is this researcher implying? I'll give you a moment to think about it. The word difference. If you said group comparison study, you would be correct. Also, the word difference implies that the researcher is going to use some type of analysis to test a hypothesis of difference. Here we see that it looks like there's one dependent variable, which is perceived learning, and one independent variable with two groups, synchronous versus asynchronous. So the researcher really is implying in this question the use of potentially an independent t-test. So you can see that the terminology that you use in posing your question should be precise. It should represent what you are examining and the type of research design and analysis that you plan to use. It's also a good idea, I'll make a note here, to make sure that there's alignment between your problem statement, your purpose statement, your research questions, your hypotheses, your research design, and analysis. So after you've written your entire research plan, you want to go through and make sure that there's good alignment between these elements. So now, in conclusion, in order to write a well-stated research question, you need to make sure that that research question asks about the relationship between two or more variables, and those variables are clearly, or more specifically, operationally defined. You need to make sure that you clearly state your question in question form. You need to make sure that your question is testable. It doesn't pose any ethical or moral problems for implementation. It's specific and restricted in scope. It identifies exactly what it is that you're going to solve, and you use terminology that reflects your research design and analysis plan. So this, as I said, concludes this tutorial on writing a well-stated research question. Now you should be ready to go out and write your research question for your proposal or research plan.